one morning as I went filing right Phoebus at dawn.
Welcome to A Cup of Technology. My name is Rochelle Newton, and I am your host. Today is August 20th, and tomorrow is the solar eclipse. Wow, I bet you are excited, aren't you? You all got your glasses and you're ready. Hopefully you don't look directly at the sun, right? So today we have a special guest with us, Mark Anthony Neal, and we will talk to him in just a few minutes. But first, let's get to our show. We have a couple of quotes. The first comes from President Obama. He said, "We need to reject any politics that targets people because of race or religion. This is a matter of political correctness. It is not a matter of political correctness. It is a matter of understanding what makes us strong. The world respects us not just for our arsenal. It respects us for our diversity and our openness and the way we respect every faith." The next quote, "We have enormous progress in teaching everyone that racism is bad. We seem to have dropped the ball when it's teaching what racism actually is." And I think that's absolutely correct. So what is racism? And the last from Albert Einstein, he says, "What a sad error it is when it is easier to smash an atom than it is to smash prejudice." I think that's powerful right there. So in the technology news, there's so much to be said, but really what's interesting in technology is what happened in Charlottesville. So we had a tragic event there in this protest between two groups trying to put their views forward, and Mr. Trump had some things to say in that forum there about what he thought the event portrayed and who was right and who was wrong. Well, the interesting thing was how technology companies responded to that. So Tim Cook of Apple disagreed with Mr. Trump's response, and he did so in such a way, he did it more than just his words. He donated $2 million to the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League. In addition to this, Mr. Cook said for every dollar his employees would donate to a human rights group, Apple would donate too. He said their company would also allow their customers to donate to the Southern Poverty Law Center through iTunes, which is a powerful thing. PayPal also took steps of this nature. They made sure that hate groups could not use PayPal to transfer payments, which is powerful. Other Silicon Valley companies have also joined this. GoDaddy and Google also stopped hosting neo-Nazi websites. Facebook took down many of the white supremacist pages and groups that are out there. GoFundMe stopped using stopped white supremacists from using GoFund campaigns. And then Apple has denied payments to anyone using those kinds of forums. And while all of these things are to be applauded and lauded for their rightness, there is another message there. So if these companies can actually stop these kinds of activities, what is to say that would prevent them from taking actions from other groups that they did not feel met the criteria of their social activism within those companies? The larger message that this sends to our society is that, yes, we should prevent hate in our society and we should use every means necessary, but the fact that so few have such powerful access to the internet. So as you cogitate on that, we are going to start and talk to Mark. So let me test Mark's mic. So Mark, good morning.
Good morning.
Let's try again. Good morning.
Good morning.
That's better. Good morning, Mark. So it's afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
That's wonderful. I have so much to ask you. So let's start. Are you telling us a little bit about yourself? So tell us education, career, how you came to be who you are today. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm a professor of African-American Studies and English at Duke. I'm also currently the chair of the department. Born and raised in the South Bronx. Went to New York City public schools, got educated at the State University in New York system for a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD, the latter which I got from the University of Buffalo in American Studies. And I'm, my area of scholarship is Black popular culture and media, with also some interest in gender and sexuality and Black intellectual traditions.
That's wonderful. How long have you been at Duke?
Been at Duke 14 years now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I assume you've seen it evolve. Changes have come in student populations, in faculty. Yes?
Yes. I will say about Duke, it's in many ways like many other institutions with some of the same struggles. It just do so with much more resources.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So can you say, first let me go back and ask you, so how did you decide that Black culture and populations and issues would become the center of your work? How did you decide that, or was that something that just evolved over time?
It really was my father. My father, who dropped out of school in the 10th grade, was a functional illiterate. He couldn't read, but had a tremendous love of gospel music quartets, Hammond B3 specialists like Jimmy Smith and Jimmy McGriff, and baseball.
Right.
And he passed all of those loves on for me at a very young age. It was the way that he articulated his sense of the world and his own intellectual acumen. And I decided that when I got older and I decided that I wanted to go into a life of the mind, I wanted to do the kind of work that my father would find value in, that he would recognize that people like my father would find value in, that they would be proud of.
Well, that's wonderful. So can you talk a little bit about your work? So I read Looking for Leroy. It's a powerful view of Black men.
Yeah.
So can you tell me what led you to write that book, and what was your goal in writing the book, and what has been the reception of the book?
So, Looking for Leroy, the idea of it really begins a few years earlier. Looking for Leroy came out in 2013. Around 2002, I started writing a book about Black masculinity. As a graduate student in American Studies, my graduate director was a woman by the name of Masani Alexis DeVoe. She was a former editor at Essence. She was an avowed feminist. She also was a lesbian. And somehow we connected as soon as I got in grad school. And we were very quaint in our relationship. After I was done at the University of Buffalo, we would write letters to each other. 2 or 3 times a year, we would write long letters back and forth. And she was the one who suggested to me both that I needed to write a book on Black masculinity, because she sensed in me that there was something feminist about the way that I thought about Black masculinity. She's like, you need to write a book about Black masculinity, about being a parent, about being a father and all those, and a partner and all those things. And you need to call it New Black Man. So Looking for Leroy really began in the same platform in which I was thinking about Black masculinity. At some point I realized there were really 2 different books. Right. So New Black Man, which comes out in 2005, is more of a blueprint for thinking about a progressive Black feminist manhood. And the thing that I didn't do in New Black Man was actually look at specific cultural text. So Looking for Leroy is more the attempt to look at these kind of mediated texts and trying to tease out progressive notions of Black masculinity, right? So there's a chapter on Avery Brooks, who's one of my favorite actors, and I love the work that he did in A Man Called Hawk, back in the day. So I look at him within that context, but also Deep Space Nine. Right. Many years later. The biggest chapter is actually one on Jay-Z. And I'm proud to say that work really anticipates the Jay-Z that we see emerge during the course of the summer. Right. With 444. There's also a chapter on Luther Vandross, a chapter on R. Kelly. And so, it was an attempt to bring the tools that I use as a scholar to bear on these cultural icons and tease out some sort of notions of a complicated Black masculinity. Yep.
So can I ask you a question? In your opinion, is there 2 separate things between a Black man and Black masculinity? Are they 2 separate things?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, if you're talking about Black men, you're talking about who we are physically, right? And who we might mean culturally in the world. Masculinity is a whole set of cultural norms and practices, expectations that we attach to men who present, to bodies that present as male. So if there's a way to think about it, Black men are who we are physically. Black masculinity is the kind of culture that has erected around the idea of what a Black man is.
And do you think Black culture as a whole, but specifically Black men, actually recognize those 2 separate constructs?
I don't think they always do. I think part of what I try to challenge in both Looking for Leroy and also New Black Man is that we've been handed a set of scripts, social expectations on how men are supposed to act, how Black men are supposed to act, that aren't biologically determined, right? They're cultural expectations. And part of what I really was trying to particularly younger Black men, to just simply be comfortable in their skin, their bodies, not to have to play into these expectations of what a quote unquote a real man is or a strong man is. That manhood and our lived lives are so much more complicated than these scripts that we've been given.
Excellent. So let me ask you a question that may skirt that a little bit. So there's a part of our youth, there's when we get to a certain age where we're sort of adults and then we get close to our old age. So when we're young, we have a little bit more veracity and we're bold. And then we get to, an adult age, if you will, where we're settled and we're trying to be that family role. And then we get to old age. Do you think that changes for black men in ways that are different than the way it changes for black women? And that might be more universal, not even by race, but I mean, do you think it changes in the portrayal of black men? And I have a follow-on question to that.
Yeah, I think it does. In the way that I think black men themselves come into a maturity. I'll use Jay-Z as a good example. What we've been able to witness with Jay-Z, this past summer with 444 is we've been able to publicly watch somebody grow up and mature.
Right.
And that maturation process has been going on for a while, but he was suddenly in a place where he allowed us inside to that process, right? And so in many ways it disrupts our notions of who late 40, 50-year-old black men are supposed to be. But I think there are many black men who go through that kind of process. I think it's different for black women because black women are raised to be much more attuned not only to their own needs and their family's needs, but in ways in which they're absolutely attuned to the needs of black men. One of the stories I tell, in New Black Man, the book that comes before Looking for Leroy, I think about things like fibroids. And if you were to ask the average African-American man, right, and even someone who cares dearly about his mother and his sisters and his partners, whoever, his female friends, you would ask them what fibroids were. Most of them would be at a loss to describe what it is,
Absolutely.
right? But yet fibroids may affect, according to some studies, up to 80% of all black women. And I always ask the question, could you imagine something that afflicted 80% of all black men that black women wouldn't know about, right? And so there's kind of an cultural expectations, social expectations on black women to know things, right? That those same kind of expectations aren't always placed on black men.
I think that's wonderful. So when you think about that maturation process that you described, how do you see that for young men that are either dropping out of school, incarcerated, early fathers, all of these things that have tremendous economic impacts, but also have societal impacts?
Well, I think we still are living with generations of folks who don't have long life expectations. If you're raised in situations in which you're dealing with incredible poverty, not a whole lot of life opportunities, education and otherwise, the type of young men who find themselves in gangs and find themselves in some of the illicit economies within our communities, I don't think they're planning for any form of longevity, right? Unfortunately, they haven't been given social cues by the larger society. The larger society even expects them to live those kinds of lives. That's why I think when you get figures, even more so than, say, a Barack Obama, right? A Barack Obama, has gone through a particular kind of trajectory. We could have expected him to turn out who he expected to turn out. Even as the son of a single mother, we're talking about a Caucasian single mother, right? And we're talking about someone who had the support of her parents, right? So he was always going to turn out fine. And I always often also want to disrupt the notions that just because children are born into single family settings means that single parent settings, that they immediately, their life chances are going to be affected in that regard. Everybody in the room helps to raise a child, right? And if there's strong social structures there, even the single mother will be able to succeed, or single father in some cases. But someone like Jay-Z, I think, is much more complicated because, what we know of him is someone who's hustling on the street, right? He has no expectations that he's going to become who he has become 20 years later. Right. So I think it's a great example for young folks to see that they can invest in their lives, that there are opportunities to come out of it. I think we also need to be very clear that not everybody is made for a traditional academic career.
Absolutely.
Right? We need to allow folks to find their skill set and their strengths and to be able to pursue those without necessarily being driven to academic success in that regard. That's just the reality of where we are at this point in time.
I think that's a wonderful point. So to that point, you've got Barack Obama, who I totally agree with you. He's an outlier. He's not the norm, right? But then you have LeBron James. You have other folks who come from single-parent homes, the young man from The Blind Side, where they have found sources from outside that have come in and saved them. But those still are
Michael Orr.
Yep, outliers. They are not the norm. So in cases where you have young black men where there are no, I shouldn't say no, where there's limited strong support, where are those students and where are those young people, in the school system, in the larger society, and where you view them? And let me just say this. So I'll tell you a story I tell often. So I watch a lot of crime shows, and there's a young black man, I think he was 17 years old, and he kidnapped a young white woman, and he took her out to a field, and he raped her, and he shot her several times. And while he was doing this, she was constantly talking to him, trying to make him see her as human. And so when he was eventually arrested, they were trying to, the police were, manhandling, but they asked him, why'd you do this? And, and you were talking about, things she had said to him. And so he said, why would I see her as human when no one has ever seen me as human? So the thought about that, your point is they don't have long expectation, but the fact that they don't even see themselves as human.
If they don't value their lives, they're not going to value other people's lives.
Right.
I think that's why it's important that we need to seriously look at the reforms of our institutions. Beginning with K through 12, we start to see, for lack of a better way to describe it, the policing of black and brown bodies very early in the process, right? In the way that, what might be seen as kind of just playfulness among some of their white peers is seen as a gateway to criminality, when certain kinds of things are played out with young black and brown children. We need them to have much more contact in these institutions with people who look like them.
Absolutely.
And it needs to be folks who they don't see simply as, security guards, in the school, or their coaches,
janitors.
Right? Janitors, right? They need to see folks who are having that kind of face-to-face contact that they often get more often than not with young white women, right, who in many ways are disconnected from their lives,
Absolutely.
right? And so that becomes important. And if it can't happen in a formal school setting, right, we need to create spaces where that's occurring outside of the classroom. 40 years ago, even when the schools were segregated and when they get desegregated and black kids aren't seeing black teachers anymore, they still were going to church on a Saturday or a Sunday, and they were seeing black adults, right? There were still little
successful
league,
black
right?
adults.
There were still little league programs, in the hood, so they were seeing adults. And we've lost some of those kinds of structures, right? It makes it a little bit more difficult for the community to actually take up what the school is not providing in that regard.
Absolutely. And so in the society, and I hate to harp on this because I know a lot of people think that we say, oh, poor us black people. But if you look at structure, so there are these programs on the History Channel that talks about how America became what America is. America could not be what America was without the labor of people of color. Right. And I mean every structure. So if you go back further than that, Native Americans, the first colonists that came over would have starved to death had it not been for the Indians. They would have frozen to death had it not been for the Indians teaching them how to use beaver's fur to clothe themselves. But when you think about that, and then to think about economically where we fit in the structure of our society, why is that the case that even now, not even going to the far side of white supremacy in these extreme cases, but even trying to find a place where we belong in the society economically, why is that still such a struggle for us?
I think a lot of it is structure. I mean, there's no question about that. Everybody, talks about how great Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, was. I think the most important work that he did in the last 5 years was the piece that he did on redlining, that really established how fundamentally the economic structures of urban life in America kept black folks having access to developing wealth and the kind of stuff that's sustainable. I know Duke, for instance, as an institution, has tried to, and let's be honest about this, they've tried to buffer the university by making sure that there are folks around the university who are invested in the university, right? And part of that has been to extend the housing program, for not necessarily the professionals at Duke, but for other folks so they can be homeowners. And what's so interesting about it is that, many of these folks, come from family histories in which their homes and their land might have been lost because of the expansion of the university, right? And that gets lost in the conversation.
Yes, it does.
So you're talking about, particularly here in the South, where we've had generations of folks before, say, 1965, who owned their own houses, had their own land, provided for themselves in certain kind of context, and we saw that slowly erode, right? We've seen the most spectacular examples of that, whether that's Oklahoma and the Black Wall Street out there, whether or not that's right in Durham and Durham's own version of Black Wall Street. Whenever there have been examples of black folks coming up right? There always has been a systematic erosion of that, usually come from white supremacist forces, but also folks who aren't necessarily wearing hoods,
Right.
right? You know, these kind of benign institutions that are here for the benefit of the larger community, but what they tend to take away from are, you know, Black strengths in that regard. You know, one of the things I will proudly say is that my parents, you know, when I was growing up, and they were wondering where they wanted to send me, they didn't send me to public schools in New York for grades 1 through 8. They actually sent me to the only Black 7-day Adventist school in the Bronx. And I think they just wanted me to be safe, but when all was said and done, it allowed me to go through 1 through 8 in a situation in which all the folks who I thought is knowledgeable, right, folks who produce knowledge, were responsible for giving me knowledge, right, were not only just Black people, but Black women, right? And being in this Black institution fundamentally changed the way that I thought about the power of such institutions. I don't think young Black folks see enough examples of that, right? Black institutions are actively demeaned in this regard. Like, I don't mean to harp on Jay-Z, but he just did this interesting interview with Rap Radar, and they were talking about LeVar Ball. And LeVar Ball, of course, you know, is the father of these basketball playing sons, and he talks too much and all this kind of stuff. But the fact that he tried to buck the trend and establish his own shoe line, right, instead of going to Nike or Adidas or some of these other companies. And Jay-Z's like, why can't we respect that for what it is, right? Because at some point, Nike was the new kid on the block.
Right.
At some point, Adidas was a new kid on the block. Why do we demean Black folks who attempt to do that same kind of thing? If we didn't support those institutions, we wouldn't have seen the development of something like both Johnson companies, right? Whether or not we're talking about the hair care products or we're talking about the magazine empire.
Right. That's exactly correct. So I want to follow on that, but I want to ask you a question. Did you have mentors when you were coming along, and do you still have a mentor?
You know, my success, and I tell folks this all the time because there's no way to explain my trajectory, right? I'm not all that smart. Like, I'd like to consider myself brilliant, right? But I know fundamentally that's not the reason why I've been able to achieve why I've achieved. My parents, you know, my mother left her home in Baltimore at 16, moved to New York, got a GED, again, marries this man who can't read. My mother fundamentally understood that there were limits to what she could provide for me, right? And she always found folks that she thought could be mentors for me. So at very young ages, whether or not it was at the Boy Scouts or the beauty parlor, you know, where I would sit after school every day until my mother came home from work. The woman who owned the beauty parlor had a sister who was very accomplished, and she was someone who guided me through my career until her death at age 99, like 3 years ago. And so I knew when I got older, whether that's high school and college, to seek out folks who could be mentors. In college, that was, you know, young white women professors, because I didn't have any contact with Black professors as an undergraduate. A woman by the name of Jan McVicker, another one by Karen Mills Courts. There was also an older student who, when I first met him, his name was Donald Smith. By the time he graduated, he had successfully gone through the Nation of Islam and had become Donald Muhammad. He's now Minister Halim Muhammad, who runs the Nation of Islam in the city of Buffalo. He was a tremendous mentoring figure for me because, you know, what he understood is that part of his job was to impart knowledge. And he would just hand me books. You know, the first book I read from Donnell Lee / Hakeem Mahmoudi, Enemies, A Class of Races. I mean, he handed me that book, and I just went to the bibliography of the book, and that was my first dig into the rabbit hole. I do what I do today in part because of those conversations that I had with Minister Halim Muhammad, you know, who made me hungry for knowledge. When I became, you know, a college student, when I became a graduate student, right, I always sought out, you know, mentors. And because they weren't necessarily always around me, I had to reach out. You know, one of the most important mentors I have to this day is someone like Michael Eric Dyson, you know, who very early in my career and what was still early in his career, you know, saw something, right? And has always provided all kinds of support for me to be successful. So mentors are absolutely important. And it's been important for me to give that back, right? You know, there's lots of things that folks can say about me when folks can say of me that I've been a good mentor to them, or tell folks you need to talk to him because he's a good mentored figure. That's like the best thing, you know, I can hear.
And so how do we get that for our larger community? So I've been struggling with Duke to start a mentorship program, and they've, you know, pushed back so much about that. But how do we, if not in Duke, even in our own community, how do we espouse the value of mentorship? How do we encourage folks to step forward in that role? What do you recommend, or what do you suggest?
I mean, part of it is that individual folks have to be secure in who they are first.
Right.
You know, we live in a society, and this is clearly the case with successful Black folks, where we're all on the grind, right? And we're all positioned in our individual jobs and institutions as the Black person, right? You know, so when another Black person shows up, you know, immediately we're threatened, you know, by their presence, right? So part of it is us having some sort of sense of ourselves, security in who we are, right? And you really can't do good mentoring unless you're comfortable in who you are in your career and what you're capable of. So part of that is that, you know, we need to take care of ourselves, right? When we can take care of ourselves, we can be better mentors and better supporters, you know, to folks who need the help. We also need to think about mentoring in a myriad ways, right? It can't simply be the formal versions of it. Some of it is more informal, right? Some of it occurs when you're not even attempting to do it, right? Just in the everydayness of a relationship, you know, having coffee, having lunch on a regular basis, you know, recognizing that there's always a time where someone can impart some information of value to you. There's always an opportunity for you to impart information, you know, to other folks.
That's wonderful, and I think that's the thing that we need to figure out how to do. I always tell people are still waiting for the next Dr. King or Malcolm X to come save us. There is none of those people are coming in, because we've got too many tools to communicate, and housing all of that stuff in one place is impossible. So let me ask you this: how did you start with Left of Black, and what is Left of Black, and can you talk about how its influence and what you're doing with it, the kind of things that Left of Black? So
you know, Left of Black goes back to that conversation I had earlier about me finding value in Black institutions. You know, we've been raised to think that, you know, when it's all shiny and white, for lack of a better way to describe, it's better.
It's better.
Clearly, it's prettier, and sometimes it has many more resources, and sometimes it pays us well. And we make whatever choices we make in that regard. But there are things to be lost, right, including some sense of integrity or some sense of control over what you want to do. When I was in 6th grade, you know, at the 7A Adventist School, you know, I started a class newspaper, right, because there was some part of me that felt a connection to journalism, even though I didn't know what that was at the time. When I was in graduate school, I did a radio program called Soul Expressions, in which, you know, I came up with a playlist that mixed 60s soul jazz with 70s soul and R&B with some 90s hip hop. And I can remember the program director going, "What is this?" And I'm like, "It's what Black folks might listen to on a Sunday morning," right? You know, something very unique in that regard. So I've always been about trying to build and maintain independent institutions. When I was in grad school, you know, one of the people that I loved to watch all the time was Charlie Rose. And I remind folks that the Charlie Rose show that first launches in the early 1990s is very different than what it was, right? It was much more free-flowing, much more independent, much less concerned about what was happening in Washington. And I remember one time, you know, seeing Cornel West on the Charlie Rose show. Another time seeing the then Black president of RIP. She's currently now the president, Brown. And Manning Marable and Michael Eric Dyson. And I was like, I want to be on Charlie Rose, right? Yeah. If I'm going to be a public intellectual, I want to be on Charlie Rose. And it never happened, right?
Still time,
right? But what that created in me, you know, about 7 or 8 years ago is a need to have a Charlie Rose-like show. That looked at the work that Black academics or academics who were interested in Black studies were doing. And the technology was there to do it. You know, I also grew up in New York City watching the late, great Gil Noble. We had a public affairs show called Like It Is. Like It Is ran for almost 30 years, almost until his death a few years ago. And what I remember about Like It Is was the number of times that ABC TV in New York attempted to take it off the air. and the community rallied around it, right? In some ways, I can't even imagine a public affairs program in 2017 that would be so connected to a community that they would support it in that way. But also was the folks that he had on the show. The first Malcolm X speeches I ever heard, I heard on Gil Noble's show, right? The first time I heard of a John Henrik Clark or a Doc Den, it was on Gil Noble's show, right? And so I wanted also something that paid tribute to the space of love that Gil Noble created, a space that lovingly treated Black thinkers, Black intellectuals, Black artists, Black art, Black scholarship, and that was what Left of Black really was. I don't think we knew what it was going to become when we started, but we knew there was this new thing called Skype.
Yep.
And that allowed us to be able to Skype people in, with our huge monitor, and to record the monitor as if they were sitting with me. And what I found is that amongst the Black intelligentsia, folks had a hunger.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've been able to manage, to have some pretty exceptional folks. We've had Cornel West and Melissa Harris Perry and Mike Eric Dyson, Eddie Glaude, all these folks on the show. At the same time, we've had some young scholars and unknown scholars who've had a space to talk about how significant their work. This past week, I met a very young scholar who's a psychologist, teaches at a small school in the Northeast. He was down here for a conference, came and handed me a copy of his new book, hoping that, he one day would be able to come on Left of Black. I'm proud of the work that we've done, myself and Catherine Angst, who shoots the show and produces and does all the editing. Camille Jackson, who's assisted so much in terms of promoting it. I'm proud of the work that we've done to be able to create something independent even within Duke, without having a lot of resources. And there's still folks at Duke that don't know what it is, right? But when I'm at a conference out in the world, right, people know me because they know of Left of Black. When I'm at the KFC a few years ago, and dude serving me, and he's like, "You're that dude I saw talking to Cornel West," right? That's when I know the show is reaching the audience that it needs to reach.
Absolutely. It's a phenomenal show. Every time I get a chance to listen, and I love your tweets. I love following you and see what you tweet. Sometimes it's a little too political for my law school conservative friends, but, it's beautiful things. So you and I met through the John Hope Franklin Center.
Yes.
You interviewed me on my Still Hidden STEM presentation. So tell us about your work at John Hope Franklin and the association between John Hope Franklin and Left of Black. Is it just because it's at that space, or is there some other?
The Department of African American Studies, which I'm now fortunate to chair, was housed in the John Hope Franklin building until 2006. So when I first came to Duke, that was the home of the department. So I always had a special affinity for the building, right? Because that was my first home at Duke. John Hope Franklin also was still alive, and still had an office in the building. So it was always wondering. He drove a brown Lexus. So it'd always be nice to come in and you would see the Lexus sitting there, and you would know that John Hope was there. What must it be like to be able to have an office in a building that's like named after you? So I always had a special affinity to it. Left of Black launches in 2010, a year after John Hope Franklin's death. And at that time, the department had moved from the John Hope Franklin Center over to East Campus in the Freedom Building. And I really decided if I was going to do a show, it's something that I really wanted in the John Hope Franklin Center to pay a tribute to him, but also the legacy of what he meant in terms of Black studies, not only globally, but obviously in terms of, Black intellectual production at Duke. And it's been a very formidable, relationship. I always joke about my relationship with Catherine Angst. She was a young white woman from Western Pennsylvania who knew very little about the intricacies of Black culture, I will say.
Right.
But she herself was an artist, someone who was a quilter, someone who was a filmmaker, and she brought that passion to the making of Left of Black. I always tell folks, it's like, can we just listen to it? It's like, you can listen to it, but, Catherine is so great with editing and B-rolls. It's really something to be watched because we are presenting an archive on top of the conversation.
Absolutely. It's an amazing thing, and I think it's very wonderful, the work that you do. I wonder, though, do you fear any kickback from Duke for censorship or concern for what they may say about some of the work that you do?
When we first launched Left of Black, there was some discussion about the title, because they couldn't figure out what the title was.
Right.
And I wasn't necessarily open to defining it, right? In early days, we just called it a contrarian view of blackness. They immediately thought it was going to be a political show, pivoting on the political left, right? And my politics are on the left, but, that's not the kind of work that I do, right? And in the early days, I think they were very conscious of some of the images that we showed and things like that. But for the most part, for the last 6 years, since the launch, they have largely ignored us.
Ah, okay.
I think there's always a kind of shift to that. I think there's always a sense that folks are watching. But because what we do doesn't resonate to them. Mm-hmm. I don't think they pay much attention to it at all. And, I'm at this point in my career that, I love whatever prestige I get from the academy, whatever kudos I get from Duke. But when all is said and done, what most concerns me is how folks value me in them streets.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's absolutely wonderful. So I'd like to play a word game with you. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to say a word. I'd like you to tell me what you think that word means, and then how you see that word in the narrow community of people of color, and in the larger society. Mm-hmm. Okay, ready?
Yeah.
Race.
I think one of the things that defines the experiences of black folks in this country, to know where the lines are, to know what the possibilities are, right? The always reminder that when you walk into the room, race walks into the room with you. I think for the larger society, they see it as a distraction. They see it as black people's problems. They see it as something not to be transcended, but to be largely ignored. And if it's ignored, whatever problems are associated with it would disappear.
What is race, though? I mean, you get an application, and there's some boxes. There's black and Hispanic, not something other, white, not something another, and you got all these things. And you got this wonderful box called other, which I found more and more people are checking that box. What is race?
So we know in most folks' imaginations, race means how people are embodied, right? If someone's walking down the block, how do I find a user-friendly way to identify who they are? That's a white person. That's a black person. That's a Chinese person. That's a Puerto Rican person. But Puerto Rican isn't a race.
Right.
It's an ethnicity.
Right.
Do you really know that that's a Chinese person?
Exactly. I was going to say, how do you know?
Japanese or Filipino or Korean?
Vietnamese,
right?
or,
those are national,
right.
nationalities and ethnicities.
Asian.
Right. So race, I think, is a shortcut for most Americans to be able to try to identify folks. The conversation that folks less want to have is that our notions of race are also embedded in our notions of race are all these social and cultural ideas of what they mean, right? We might call them in passing stereotypes, but it's something much more deeper than that. It's the reason why when you see a group of black folks come together and protest, right, you immediately assume it's either some sort of violence and criminality that's going to play out. Right. But when you actually see white men with torches,
right, you don't think that,
and side pieces, right, and clear intent of violence, right, you don't read the possibility that violence on those bodies.
Right, they're defending the land, right, they're protecting some freedom, right. Okay, so my next word, husband.
Ooh, I think in black communities, husband has had less formal meanings than informal meanings. And I mean that to say there was a time where black folks historically could not marry, mm-hmm, but yet they created relationships, right, extra legal, right, even criminal relationships that talked about the power of partnership. I think there are black men and women who have considered themselves husband and wife that never get recognized, even in the 21st century, who never get recognized by the state, right, as husband and wife. I think for the most part, I would say that the mainstream society thinks about husband a certain kind of way, but when you look at divorce rates, the sanctity of those relationships mean something very different. My wife and I have been married now for 26 years. My parents, before my dad died, were married for 44 years.
Wow.
My wife's parents were married for about 39 years before my father-in-law passed. One of the most radical things that black people do is stay in relationships.
Yes.
Right. And it doesn't mean the relationships aren't complicated,
Right.
right? That they don't have their problems, right? But there's something about the sustainability of these relationships.
Continuity.
When so much of society is disposable.
Right.
Right. And so, my daughters, right, and I don't know what their choices are going to be. One is 18 and one is 14. Because of my parents and because of their parents, they now have at least 2 generations of models.
Right.
Of at least what's possible for them if they choose that particular route.
So Oprah has started this new series called Black Love.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to describe what black love looks like. So if you ask, you can get a white person to be truthful with you about what black love looks like. It's we have sex every day, we don't have intimacy, we fight, and the man is absent from the relationship. He's got many other partners out there. And I think that's a stereotype that has been perpetuated. There's these things that they say about us, and so that's my next word coming up. But that view, Bill Cosby was this exception. The Cosby family was this exception. So there was this thing that looked like, and then you have Blackish, which is another weird kind of show there like this. And I don't think either one of them are a
Right,
true
right.
depiction of what black lives look like, because as you said, some of them are complicated, but I think more than anything else, they're no different than any other relationship. I think we're less likely to kill our spouses, but other than that, we are no different. Is that your what the information you've been able to obtain and the people you've talked to, and how you see relationships from black masculinity, how we are in relationships,
Right.
black man to black woman, black man to white woman, or whatever kind of woman he chooses, or partner?
If I'm going to be honest, and if folks who are in long-term relationships are honest, right? It is not a party every day.
Right.
Right. It is difficult, right?
Right.
You're talking about 2 different people with 2 different things that drive them. Their financial pressures, their child-rearing pressures, their professional pressures in both of their lives. It's all of that kind of stuff. What I have seen out of long-term black relationships is that there still remains a sanctity in the primacy of that relationship, right? So that, even if you have examples of men who might have other needs elsewhere, right? That doesn't undermine the relationship, right? It's not brought home,
Right.
right? There's like, in some ways when we see these examples of the mafia and the Tony Sopranos, right? They seem to get that, right?
Right.
In ways that like mainstream society doesn't attach, right, to white people, right? But in ways that are complicated with black folks. I think black folks, the best way to describe black love is that black love is human.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's it. And human is going to be challenged in all kinds of ways. I know so many examples of folks who have been in long-term marriages in which you don't necessarily see in the everydayness of it the romance. I mean, the romance absolutely disappears, right?
Right.
You don't necessarily see the intimacy. But let one of those folks get sick.
Right.
Let one of those folks have exceptional needs, right? And those folks are always there to take care of it. It's like I always joke with my wife, it's like, you will never have to worry about me leaving you for a 25-year-old, because at this stage of my life, I know that 25-year-old's not going to take care of me.
Right. That's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, my next word, Mandingo.
A film with Ken Norton from the
Love it.
1970s that played off of this notion of the well-endowed black man.
Yes.
I think for many folks in the mainstream, they don't know much about the film. They don't know who Ken Norton was.
Right.
but the idea of it still maintains the same, right? This idea of the well endowed, right? Or this idea that, all black men, right, somehow fit this stereotype of Mandingo.
So that thing extrapolates possibly to race, so why white women may gravitate to black men or men of color.
The curiosity for it, right? I mean, and that curiosity is historical,
right?
Historic, yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so thug.
It's funny. I know some thugs.
Don't we all?
And in many ways, they were part of the fabric of the communities that I grew up in, right? That some of us grew up in. They were enforcers. Mm-hmm. You knew to be on the right side of them, to not cross them. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I think they also considered themselves part of the community, right? And I always find it funny that, we throw this term thug around. And when I think that growing up in the 1970s, right, the perfect definition of a thug in American culture was Henry Winkler, playing the Fonz on Happy Days, right? But he was lovable, and we've very rarely been able to apply that version of the thug to black folks, which is why I was drawn to Avery Brooks's performance of Hawk and A Man Called Hawk, right? Because once you got past this exterior and you dealt with some of his interiority, this is a far more complex, right, intimate, engaged figure than the large society gives him credit for. I think it's a term that's thrown around now in the mainstream as a way to talk about black criminality without saying the obvious markers of black criminality. And let's be honest, even our black president of 8 years fell prey to that at various times rather than to, really own what black folks were raging against. It was very easy sometimes to think about those ragers and present them in a certain kind of way, that it didn't seem as though he had too much affinity with those folks. And I get the political reasons for that. But, there was a time earlier in my career where I called myself a thug, Nword intellectual. And I did that again to highlight, as I was now coming through these institutions, where I came from. Yeah. Right. And there are places still today where if white folks see me, I'm such a curiosity in this place that the default, right, is almost if, well, he must be a thug. Right. Clearly when I was younger, right? I'm 51 now, so not as much, but there still is enough of that kind of curiosity about your presence in places where you're not necessarily supposed to be, that folks go to that default meaning, right? And a thug is one of those default meanings.
I think so. Boy.
It was a term that was used in the American South for a long time, to emasculate black men, right? Black men, and it's the reason why in the midst of the Civil Rights Movement, the Sanitation March, before King's death, when you see posters of black men with placards that say, "I am a man," right? It was in direct response to the larger society refusing to acknowledge the adulthood of black men, black manhood. And you see vestiges of it even today. I've long suggested that when we see, for instance, the emergence of hip hop and what hip hop is and the way that we choose to talk about it, hip hop at this point is a multi-billion-dollar industry, right? It has created its own billionaires. Yeah. When you talk about, Dr. Dre and Jay-Z and Beyonce and a range of these other folks. But yet we continue to infantilize it. Right. So rather than talk about the fact that, as an art form, it's more than 40 years old, right? Almost 50 years old. It has had such an imprint on the culture that folks who are circuit judges and lawyers and doctors and professors and a whole range of folks who are accomplished professionals consider themselves the byproduct of hip hop. We continue to infantilize the culture, right? As if it only reaches 16 or 17-year-old folks. And again, you don't have to call somebody a boy, but if you treat what they produce, right, as something that is boyish or childish, right, it's having the same kind of effect.
I think so. So we only have about 5 minutes, but I want to get 2 words in. Predator.
A term that ultimately took down the potential of a Hillary Clinton presidency because of a speech where she talked about super predators 20 years ago. So folks forget that quite a few number of black elected officials signed on to that because whatever a super predator was, they were afraid of them also. I think there's a way in which we attach predatory actions to black men, right? When we think about the stereotype of the black male rapist. I think there are actual predators in our community, and we need to be clear about who they are and that they don't represent who black men are. R. Kelly is a predator, right? Bill Cosby is a predator, right? We have other examples, right? There's, this white guy who's actually a Duke alum, in the tech industry who's a predator, right? I think the challenge for me with thinking about predators is that, once that's identified, right, and particularly if it's identified as a sickness, folks need to go to jail or they need to go to jail. But when they're coming back from jail, how do we deal with them? How do we reintegrate them back into our communities? And I don't think we've had enough of those conversations, particularly black communities. We haven't had enough of those conversations yet.
That's excellent. My last word is probably the most obvious, the N-word.
It is one of my favorite words.
Wow.
And that's not to discount the historic meanings of it. White person walked past me with a certain inflection and uses that word. I know exactly what that is. But I also know that in response to the power of that word, black artists, writers, creative people have created extraordinary cultural moments in response to it. So whether it's the last poets talking about N-words, scared of revolution, or a group like NWA, right, which for all their personal faults as young men, created an entity that was at the forefront of pushing back against police brutality when there was no public language around it. With F the police and things of that nature. There was a labor union leader, Shirley Ann Jackson. She was a labor leader in New Jersey. She wrote an autobiography in 1978 called An Nword at My Window. And she talks about early in the book how as a 3-year-old growing up in the first decade of the 20th century, she could see how black folks use the term as an umbrella term, a term of endearment, a term to distinguish who her family was from other folks. The way that black folks have deployed the word, even in the knowledge of historical uses, has been absolutely brilliant, right? And at least from the standpoint of pedagogy, in the classroom, it's a term that I like to utilize as a way for us to think about difference. I will often say to white students as we're trying to talk about this in terms of race, if there are no black folks in the room, who becomes the N-word?
Right.
And it helps them to think about how even white folks do this process, particularly around ethnicity and class and things of that nature.
Very good. So house in, feel in, still in.
Yeah, I mean that was the genius of what Jay laid down with the story of OJ, right?
Right.
None of us are allowed to not be read within that context, right? Even if we're worth $500 million.
That's exactly correct. So this is wonderful. I hope you'll come back. I have many more. I have a page more of questions to ask and things to talk with you about. I think that your insights and your intelligence is just beyond, just a simple 55-minute conversation. We need hours and hours and hours. So I hope you'll come back again and talk with me again.
Thank you, Rochelle.
This is wonderful. Thank you for interviewing me on my Still Hidden, because I'm still hidden.
Yes, and that will be part of season 8, which will launch next month. So
yes,
we're looking forward to getting that out in the world.
Yes, I am looking forward to that too. Judge Webster did a book on the first black judge, and I'm hoping that he's going to come on the show and talk about that. So there's a lot of work still to do, and I'm so glad you're out there doing some of the work. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you, Rochelle.
Thank you. You have been listening to A Cup of Technology. Today is August 20th. I hope you take care of watching that eclipse tomorrow. Enjoy your day.